Howdy, howdy, howdy. This is the first video that I have ever produced, so not quite sure how this is going to go, but per the assignment rules, I am endeavoring to give it a shot. So hopefully crafting a new skill, however rudimentary today. So without further ado, let's get started on Austrian business cycle theory. So, the gentleman you see before you is none other than Ludwig von Mises, perhaps the most, well, definitely the most preeminent Austrian economist of the 20th century. Mises, I believe, died in the 70s. What is the Austrian school? Quick background. As the name implies, it's a school of economic thought that developed in Austria, most notably in Vienna in the late 1800s originally. By Karl Menger, was sort of one of the early progenitors of the Austrian school, and then Ludwig von Mises, his, I guess, sort of spiritual successor, ended up taking the mantle, and they're mostly known for basically developing the popularly accepted theory of price, that it is subjective, and secondly, the theory of the business cycle, the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which we will be discussing here, which I find to be quite convincing in terms of explaining economic ups and downs. Now, you, like many people, may be wondering why the market seems to go through these periodic recessions, as they're called. Why things seem to be going great, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, it all goes to hell. A bunch of industries hemorrhage cash, people lose their jobs, and there's the question why. Well, the Austrian theory of the business cycle seeks to define and outline the reasons for the business cycle. So the two linchpins of the business cycle have to do with interest rates and, more specifically, the central bank's manipulation of interest rates. So first off, in a market economy, what you have, the interest rate is a price. And just like all prices, it conveys scarcity or abundance of resources. So, for instance, if the price of wheat is very low, that must mean there's an abundance of wheat, or that the abundance is high relative to the demand. Maybe there's not a whole lot of wheat, but a bunch of people are eating barley as a substitute. Just hypotheticals here. So, the interest rate is the price. It's the price of borrowing money. It's a price of resources, essentially. Resources disposable to banks in order to lend out for people to build housing construction or capital investment or any number of things. So that's what the interest rate's for. And in a market economy, when people save, this in turn forces down the interest rate. So this means there's an abundance of cash on hand, more abundance of money for the banks to lend out. This pushes down the interest rate and signifies to investors that people are now deferring spending in the future to spend, or I'm sorry, now deferring spending now in order to spend in the future. Where this gets tricky is when central banks get involved, because the actions of people who save act as a signal to would-be investors, or they would in a market environment. But here's the problem. As the look at the slide here. As the economy grows, the government enforces lower interest rate to encourage borrowing. This is basically kind of a Keynesian argument. They're trying to prime the pump, so without getting too technical, the Federal Reserve or the central bank will expand its balance sheet, basically buy up government assets by, through fiat, essentially, and in turn is able to lower the interest rate at which banks can borrow amongst themselves more closely, I guess. So they expand credit. So credit expansion leads to higher borrowing, more investments, and directed more towards capital good products that do not reflect present time consumption demand, and higher employment levels, but at the expense of inflated prices. So obviously part of the problem with jacking up interest rates is you essentially have to create money. Now, inflation is caused by two things. One, it's caused by the quantity of money. And then two, it's determined by the velocity of money, how quickly that money changes hands. So in this last financial crisis, we saw a huge expansion of the money supply, but it was mostly kept within, I guess, sort of the sphere of the central bank, the purview of the central bank, and thus we didn't see rampant inflation. What they are trying to do is create inflation, in part. It's this weird demand side view of the economy. So the central bank does this, artificially lowers the price of money. Investors don't quite know what to do, but typically with long-term loans, I mean, obviously the thing that they're most likely to invest in is long-term intensive capital production and investment. So that's what they do. So this causes a boom of sorts, but it's all mostly founded on malinvestment. So reaching the boom, but facing the consequences of malinvestment, there's no demand for the oversupply of the unwanted production. So that's essentially it. So it's artificially increasing asset prices by decreasing, artificially, the price of money. And then in turn, there's a massive sell-off of, let's say, look at 2008, sell-off of real estate, and yeah, it's just the prices plummet. The value, the supposed value of them turns out to be moot in the face of reality. So yeah, you get overproduction from malinvestment. So contraction sets in, consumers are not spending, you got slowdown in business activity, unemployment is rising, and the government raises interest rates back to the original market level. In theory, that's what they do. Of late, the Federal Reserve has managed to push down interest rates to basically zero. And you see a thing cropping up now in world financial markets where the central banks of the world are actually keeping interest rates even negative, which a lot of people didn't even think was possible before this financial crisis. It was like, how could you loan out money at a negative interest rate? It doesn't make sense. Like, why would you give out cash with the expectation of being paid less? So, like, or if you buy a bond, why would you get less than you return? It didn't make any sense. And so, but yeah, they're frantically doing this in order to try and increase spending. But yeah, essentially what ends up happening is that you get the bust, you decline the value of investments, particularly assets. Unemployment reaches peak as investments are losing and borrowers become unable to make good on their loans. So that's basically the gist of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Pretty complicated, but I think it can be relatively understood as well to a layman, which I am. So one of the questions that arises if you're particularly nerdy like I am, is why in financial crisis it tends to be the capital-intensive industries that are hit hardest, not consumer industries like retail. Um, the reason for this is twofold. First off, the with low interest rates again in a market economy, the signals to some people, not to all of them, but to some, that people are willing to defer expenses now in order to spend in the future. So they, in turn, invest in mining, refining, purchasing of machines, increasing the capital stock, etc. The other thing is that interest rates for very long term, think about something that's not going to see a yield for years, maybe even a decade. Some major mining project that is going to have to be financed at high cost for a long time, and do you want to invest in that potentially very risky venture with expensive money or cheap money? Well, obviously you want to do it with the cheap money. The problem is that, again, the demand just isn't there, or isn't there as much as it would be in a market environment. So you get overinvestment, which is why typically the I'm fumbling over my words here, but the capital intensive aspects of the economy are hit the hardest. Think again, just sort of relating back to the Austrian school, the theory of the business cycle. There's something called the master builder analogy. So this guy, he's got these bricks, he's got this project. He begins building a house, and he's building along, and then he realizes at a certain point that he doesn't have enough bricks to finish the house. So what needs to happen is it's not just, all right, just keep at it and keep going and see what happens. No, what needs to happen is he needs to stop what he's doing. He needs to have that capital, those bricks, reallocated in order to make something else, because he doesn't have the resources on hand in order to actually finish the project. This is the side effect of, again, manipulation of expectations in the case of the master builder analogy, someone just screwed up on the blueprints, but in the case of central banking, what it chiefly does is it manages to screw up expectations of investors, because interest rates, again, are very, very important prices. They're prices, just like anything else. And without prices, you can't have honest prices. You can't have a functioning, sound economy. So, of course, people want something to blame, and it turns out there is something to blame, and that is the Federal Reserve. Yes, central banks. Through, again, just to put a bow on this manipulation of prices, in this case, interest rates, which is basically the only price they have control over, but it is an extremely important price. It screws with the investor, the entrepreneur's expectations of what they would otherwise be. They're given faulty information. And it's very hard to know in such an environment as this, aside from instinct, what to do. And I guess that's it for this presentation on the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Thank you all.